Are you ready for gas prices to double? Are you ready for your grocery bill to spike again, for another round of inflation, for the possibility of more American troops coming home in flag-draped coffins? Because that's not a hypothetical anymore. That's a real live possibility playing out right now, thousands of miles away, in a war most Americans have already stopped paying attention to. Two nations. Two nuclear-capable militaries on one side, and one government desperate to prove to its own people and the entire world that it cannot be broken on the other. And right now, tonight, they are one single mistake away from a war that wouldn't just reshape the Middle East, it would reshape the entire global economy. Your gas prices, your grocery bill, and the safety of American service members stationed anywhere near that region. I know that sounds like an exaggeration. I wish it was. But stay with me for the next 30 minutes, because I'm going to walk you through exactly how we got here, why neither side can afford to blink first, and why the thing that should scare you most isn't a deliberate act of war. It's an accident. Right now, in the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical shipping lanes on Earth, a lane that a massive share of the world's oil passes through every single day. American and Iranian forces are circling each other. Ships are being struck. Drones are being launched. American troops have already died. And the President of the United States has made promises on national television that, if fully carried out, could push this from a regional war into something the entire world gets pulled into. So let's talk about it honestly, without the spin you get from cable news, and without taking a side. Understanding this doesn't require you to pick a team, it requires you to understand strategy. Welcome back to the channel. Before we go any further, if you want breaking analysis like this delivered regularly, hit subscribe to our daily brief right now, because this story is moving fast, and I don't want you finding out what happens next from a headline. I want you to understand it before it happens. All right, let's get into it. Let's start with where things actually stand today, because a lot of the noise online has completely lost the thread of what's real and what's exaggeration. This war has technically been running since late February. It didn't begin with some massive singular explosion the way people assume wars start. It built up gradually, strike, response, the way most modern conflicts actually unfold. A ceasefire was reached partway through. For a moment it looked like both sides had found an off-ramp. That ceasefire lasted less than a month. A drone struck a cargo ship passing through the Strait of Hormuz. On its own it wasn't catastrophic, no major casualties, limited damage, but it was enough to collapse the entire agreement. Within days, both sides were back to trading strikes, and they haven't stopped since. Since then, the war has widened well beyond the strait. Iranian-backed forces in Yemen, the Houthis, have targeted tankers in the Red Sea and threatened to blockade another critical waterway, the Bab al-Mandeb. Iran struck a desalination plant in Kuwait, a country that has no formal role in this fight whatsoever. American forces reinstated a naval blockade and expanded their airstrikes from purely military targets to infrastructure, railways, power facilities, the kind of targets that hit ordinary civilian life just as hard as they hit military capability. And then there's the number that should be getting more attention than it is. Oil prices have surged nearly 40% in 3 weeks. We're talking crude trading above $100 a barrel for the first time in months. If you think that doesn't affect you sitting at home in America, think again. That's what you pay at the pump. That's what shows up in the cost of everything shipped by sea, which is almost everything you buy. And American families are already paying a human cost too. Service members have died in this conflict. The president attended a dignified transfer of soldiers killed in action. This isn't an abstract, faraway war anymore. It has already reached American soil in the way that matters most. So why does this keep escalating instead of resolving? To understand that, we need to understand both sides, starting with what's actually driving the American position. From Washington's perspective, this is about deterrence and resolve. The president has publicly and repeatedly warned that continued attacks on American forces or American shipping interests will be met with strikes on Iranian infrastructure, power plants, bridges, the backbone of the country's ability to function. This is a strategy built on the idea that overwhelming visible consequences will eventually force Iran to stand down. It's the traditional model of American military deterrence. Hit hard enough, often enough, and the other side calculates that continued resistance costs more than it's worth. That's a reasonable strategic theory. It's worked in some conflicts throughout history, but it assumes something important, that the other side is making a purely rational cost-benefit calculation the same way a Western government would. And that assumption might be exactly where this entire situation gets dangerous, because Iran isn't playing by that same playbook. And to understand why, we have to go back nearly 50 years back to where Iran's entire national strategy was actually built. In 1979, Iran went through a revolution that didn't just change who ran the government, it rebuilt the entire identity of the nation around one central idea: resistance against foreign power. Not negotiation from a position of weakness, not compromise under pressure, resistance, no matter the cost. That identity was tested almost immediately. From 1980 to 1988, Iran fought a brutal war against Iraq. Hundreds of thousands of people died. Neither side could really claim victory. But in Iran's own national narrative, that war became proof of something important, proof that the state could absorb enormous pain and still refuse to break. That lesson got baked into how Iran's leadership has operated ever since. Because Iran knew it could never match American or Israeli conventional military power directly, it built an entirely different kind of strategy, investing in a network of allied militias and political movements stretching across Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. This gave Tehran the ability to apply pressure through others at a distance without staking its own army in every single confrontation. This is why, in past crises, tanker seizures, targeted killings of senior commanders, nuclear standoffs that pushed right to the edge of war, Iran never fully backed down, and yet also never triggered the kind of all-out war that could destroy the regime. Every move was calibrated, deliberate, testing precisely how far it could go before triggering a response it couldn't survive. Which brings us to right now. Because what's happening in this war looks different from that old careful pattern, and understanding why is the key to understanding everything that comes next. Here's what most coverage of this war gets fundamentally wrong. They frame it as a simple contest. Who's winning militarily, who's losing. That's not actually the story here. The real story is two completely different definitions of victory, colliding head-on. For the United States, victory looks like traditional military dominance. Degrade the enemy's capability, force capitulation, bring them to the negotiating table on American terms. That's the conventional playbook. It's how great powers have measured success in war for generations. But Iran isn't measuring success the same way. Iran's leadership isn't counting territory held or infrastructure preserved. They're measuring something much harder to physically destroy, whether the state can be seen by its own people and the rest of the region as having refused to be broken. Think about what that actually means in practice. Every American airstrike, every warning about power plants and bridges being leveled, every single one of those becomes something Iran's leadership can absorb and fold directly into their own domestic narrative. We took the hit, and we're still standing. We did not kneel. And here's the uncomfortable part for anyone hoping this ends quickly. That kind of resistance can actually be more politically sustainable than raw military strength. because a government whose entire legitimacy is built on the promise of resistance cannot easily abandon that promise without risking collapse from within, collapse that might be more dangerous to that regime than continued war with America. Meanwhile, Iran doesn't need to match American firepower to make this war genuinely painful. Every disruption to shipping in the Strait of Hormuz sends oil prices climbing. Every strike near the Red Sea threatens global trade routes that keep economies functioning worldwide. This is asymmetric warfare in its purest form, small, targeted actions producing consequences that ripple across the entire global economy, hitting American consumers who have never even heard of the specific incidents causing it. This is not a war Iran is trying to win in the traditional sense. This is a war Iran is trying to outlast. And once you understand that distinction, the entire conflict starts to make a different kind of sense. Now let's talk about why this matters far beyond the Middle East. Why this is genuinely an American problem, not just a foreign one. Look at America's allies caught in the crossfire. Kuwait, Saudi Arabia. These are countries with no formal role in this war, and yet they've already absorbed direct hits, intercepted missiles, struck tankers, real casualties. They're stuck between a superpower ally and a regional power that refuses to yield, with no safe position to stand in. If this widens further, American alliances across the entire region are what's at stake. Then there's the economy, your economy. Oil above $100 a barrel isn't just a Middle East headline. That's inflation pressure hitting American households. That's bond yields climbing. That's mortgage rates rising for families who have absolutely nothing to do with this conflict and never asked to be part of it. And here's the part that should genuinely concern every American watching this. Who benefits while the United States pours military resources, political attention, and diplomatic capital into this war? China, Russia. Every single day this drags on is a day American strategic focus is pulled away from other global priorities, priorities that matter just as much to American interests long term. Our rivals don't need to lift a finger. They just need to watch and wait while resources are spent thin in a war of attrition thousands of miles from home. And here's what should worry you most. If Iran's strategy, enduring overwhelming pressure without capitulating, actually succeeds, other nations facing their own confrontations with American power are watching closely and taking notes. This isn't just about Iran and America anymore. This has become a test case for whether American military dominance can still force political outcomes in the modern world. And the answer to that question affects how seriously every future adversary takes American resolve for decades to come. So where does this actually go from here? Let's talk about what could realistically happen next, because I'm not going to sit here and speculate wildly. Let's talk about the real, grounded possibilities. There are essentially three paths this war could take. The first is a prolonged standoff, both sides continuing to absorb costs indefinitely. Iran keeps enduring economic pain and military losses. America keeps paying the political and financial price of an open-ended war. Neither side reaches a true breaking point. This could drag on for months, possibly much longer. That means more American troops potentially in harm's way, more instability at the pump, more uncertainty for anyone with investments tied to global markets. The second path is a negotiated settlement. But here's the real problem with that path. For it to actually work, both sides need to walk away able to claim they didn't lose. Iran needs a deal it can present at home as endurance, not surrender. America needs a deal it can present as having achieved its objectives, not retreat. We already saw exactly how fragile that balance is. The last ceasefire collapsed within weeks because of a single incident nobody could fully control. The third path is the one that should genuinely worry every American watching this: miscalculation. American soldiers have already died in this conflict. The president has explicitly tied further retaliation to striking Iranian infrastructure. Iran's leadership is politically boxed in, unable to be seen backing down without risking its own legitimacy. In an environment like that, it doesn't take a deliberate decision to trigger full-scale war. It just takes one strike, misread by the other side as something far bigger than it was ever meant to be. And that's genuinely the part that keeps military and strategic analysts up at night. Not that either side actively wants this war to spiral into something larger, but that neither side may actually be able to stop it once that spiral begins. There's also a piece of this puzzle that doesn't get nearly enough attention, and that's the role of actors who aren't fully under either government's control. The Houthis in Yemen operate with a real degree of independence from Tehran. They've launched attacks and made threats that go beyond what any centralized command structure might have planned or approved. That means even if Washington and Tehran somehow reached an understanding tomorrow, a single unauthorized strike from a semi-independent proxy force could unravel it overnight. And then there's Israel, watching this entire situation with its own separate red lines, particularly around anything connected to Iran's nuclear infrastructure. Israel's calculus doesn't necessarily move in sync with America's. A pause that Washington finds acceptable might not be acceptable in Jerusalem, and that mismatch alone could reshape this conflict regardless of what the two primary powers agree to. It's also worth taking a moment to talk about what's happening inside Iran itself, because the picture painted by official statements from Tehran doesn't always match what's happening on the ground for ordinary Iranians. Food prices have reportedly tripled in some markets since the war began. Everyday goods are becoming harder to afford. That kind of economic pressure doesn't just disappear because a government insists it's winning a war of endurance. At some point, public patience becomes its own kind of pressure on leadership, a pressure that doesn't come from Washington at all, but from inside Iran's own borders. That internal pressure is one of the more unpredictable variables in this entire situation, because nobody, not analysts, not intelligence agencies, not even Iran's own leadership, can say with certainty how much strain the public will absorb before something shifts internally. On the American side, there's a parallel dynamic worth understanding. Wars that drag on without a clear, decisive resolution tend to become politically costly over time, regardless of who's in office. Rising oil prices translate into inflation that voters feel directly. Continued troop deployments and casualties, even in a conflict framed as necessary, eventually generate questions about cost versus benefit. Historically, prolonged, open-ended military commitments without a visible endpoint have proven difficult to sustain politically, and that's a pressure that operates independently of military strategy entirely. It's a pressure measured in approval ratings, in economic data, in public patience, not in battlefield outcomes. So when you put all of these pieces together, what you get isn't really a simple story about a war between two countries. It's a layered situation involving semi-independent proxy forces, a third nation with its own separate red lines, domestic economic pressure building inside Iran, and domestic political pressure building inside the United States, all happening simultaneously, all influencing decisions made by leaders who are trying to manage far more variables than most people watching the headlines realize. Let's bring all of this together, because I want you to walk away from this video actually understanding something most people don't. This isn't simply a story about who has the bigger army, or who has more advanced weapons, or who can strike harder and faster. It never really was just that. This is a story about two governments, one built on the promise of overwhelming dominance, the other built on the promise of unbreakable resistance, each betting that the other side will reach its breaking point first. And history has taught us something uncomfortable, again and again. Raw power doesn't automatically win. Sometimes it just makes the other side dig in harder, and the war drags on longer than anyone predicted at the start. Power can flatten a power plant overnight. Power can sink a ship in minutes. Power can level a bridge before sunrise. But it is far, far harder to destroy a belief held inside a government, inside an entire population, that enduring in itself is a form of victory. Until one side finally lets go of that belief, this war may not end the way anyone currently expects it to. And that uncertainty is exactly why every American, whether you follow foreign policy closely or not, should be paying attention to what happens in the Strait of Hormuz over the coming weeks. Because the consequences of this conflict aren't staying contained to the Middle East. They're already showing up in oil prices, in shipping costs, in the broader stability of a global economy that all of us depend on, whether we ever think about geopolitics or not. That's the real story behind the headlines. Not who's winning today's news cycle, but which side is actually willing to pay the higher price for longer, and what that means for the rest of us watching from thousands of miles away. If you have any questions about anything I covered in this video, drop them in the comments below. I read every single one, and I'll be answering the best questions in future videos, because this story is far from finished. And if this kind of honest, in-depth breakdown is what you come here for, do me a favor, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to actually understand what's happening in the world right now, instead of just scrolling past the headlines, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. Because the real question isn't whether another line gets crossed in this war. It's whether, by the time it happens, any of us will even see it coming.